Hi, I'm Ashura, and today we're gonna talk Nerubian lore, because if you're anything like me, you stepped one foot into Azj-Kahet and went, how the heck do these guys relate to the Nerubians in Northrend? So today, I'm going to give you a crash course on those Northrend Nerubians and how it all ties back into Azj-Kahet and all the new lore we've learned about the Nerubians in the War Within. So let's start at the beginning. The Nerubians originally evolved from the Akir, minions of the old gods, and 16,000 years ago, well before the Sundering broke the world apart, the Akir were embroiled in a war with the Trolls. And when the Trolls won, the Akir got divided up into 3 groups and scattered to different parts across Kalimdor. A group ended up in Pandaria and became the Mantid. A group ended up in Silithus and became the Silithid. And a group ended up in Northrend to evolve into the Nerubians as we know them today. Quick side note, but the archaeology blurb for Nerubians says about half of the Akir went north to Northrend, so it wasn't like an even third split between them. It was the influence of the old gods located in each of these specific areas that caused the Akir to evolve in the way they did. So Yogg-Saron was responsible for the Akir in Northrend evolving into the Nerubians. For some indeterminate amount of time, we're not really sure how long, the Nerubians continued to worship and serve Yogg-Saron. And this is where our first point of crossover into Azj-Kahet lore happens, because there's a small little lore book that talks about the first queen of the Nerubians, how she rebelled against their dark masters, threw off their yoke of oppression, and led the Nerubians to freedom. It's probably easier to read it than describe it to you, so let me take you through that real quick. The first queen of true Nerub. In ancient times, before the children of stone or the strands of queens and sages, there was an empire born of darkness. It was a time of death and war. Hosts of armies swarmed in numbers 16 and 5 times the people of the last kingdom when this record was sown. From that crucible of darkness rose a leader who foresaw where the darkness would lead. Anub'Azek was a unique creature crafted with the power of a lord and the memory of a sage. They were made to command and lead legions into battles that they would not survive. And so Anub'Azek defied the Dark Ones that had helped in her creation. With her army, she led them deep into the earth and away from the front of a lost battle. Spurned by endless war, unwilling to sacrifice more of her people, Anub'Azek would become the first queen of the true Nerubians. Thus, our people became a people, and would never be puppets of the Empire of Darkness again. So, when I got to Azj-Kahet, I found myself wondering, what's the relationship between Azjol-Nerub in Northrend and Azj-Kahet here in Khaz-Algar? Like, were they both founded at the same time? Was one built after the other? And it's not explicitly said, this is about the closest we get to a confirmation, but I think it's really strongly implied that Azjol-Nerub in Northrend came first, because they had settled first in Northrend, and that when Anub'Azek and her Nerubian forces rebelled, it says in this text, she led them deep into the earth and away from the front of a lost battle. Makes me think that she was responsible for founding Azj-Kahet, and that Azj-Kahet was built sometime, who knows how long, after Azjol-Nerub had been established in Northrend. And I know it's mostly because it's new lore, but I like to think that makes sense of why we see this book in Azj-Kahet instead of Azjol-Nerub, that she founded this city, this empire. And so that's why there's a book here about her history and not like in Azjol-Nerub. So let's fast forward to the War of the Spider, just a few years before the Third War. The War of the Spider is probably the biggest piece of Nerubian lore we have, and there are so many things that cover it. There's like half a page in Chronicle, there's a little bit in the Exploring Azeroth Northrend book, There's quite a bit in the RPG, which is not technically canon, but a lot of the stuff from the RPG comes from Warcraft 3: The Frozen Throne, which I have not played, but I think is actually the biggest source we have on the War of the Spider. There's also an in-game lore book, not to say anything about the dungeon quests that take you through Azjol-Nerub, which I also want to get into later. But before I get ahead of myself, around like year 10 to 15-ish, at this point, Ner'zhul is the Lich King, not Arthas, that happens later. There's a bit more context here necessary to understand exactly what's going on with the Lich King, and its origins are in Rise of the Horde, but I'm just gonna glaze past that a bit because it's sort of dense and confusing. So, Ner'zhul's the Lich King. He was entombed in the Domination armor and sent to Azeroth, and when he lands on Azeroth, he's in Northrend. He essentially becomes what will be the Frozen Throne. And he is tasked by his master to dominate this planet. And who is the biggest threat to that than the Nerubians, who have an empire that spans practically half of Northrend between Borean Tundra and Ice-Crowned Glacier. As it so happens, the Nerubians were also a threat because they were not only immune to the plague of undeath, though they could be raised into undead. They were just immune to the plague. They had to be, like, actively raised. They were also immune to the Lich King's mental domination. The only thing, really, is that they weren't huge fighters. They were more artists. I sort of skipped over a bit of, like, warrior class hall lore in Legion that talks about an old conflict between the Vrykul and the Nerubians that basically was so violent it stopped the Nerubians from fighting for millennia, but that aside, Ner'zhul starts his onslaught against the Nerubians, and unfortunately, in a war of attrition, when your enemy can raise your dead to add to his army to fight against you, it's pretty hard to win. So here's our second point of crossover into Azj-Kahet. The king of Azjol-Nerub, Anub'arak, reaches out to Queen Neferis of Azj-Kahet to ask her help. And there's about 4-ish major things in-game that detail these exchanges, and I'm going to take you through each of them because they paint a pretty clear picture of what went on in Azj-Kahet during the War of the Spider. But we have Anub'arak's request to Neferis, Neferis' response, an envoy that Anub'arak sent from Azjol-Nerub, and sort of random generic NPC dialogue that just talks about the citizens of Azj-Kahet remembering the War of the Spider. So let's go through each of those real quick. The Shadecaster is worn down by time. By the looks of it, no one has been here for many years. You see a faint glow from within. It might still be operational. Queen Neferis, I, Anub'arak, King of Azjol-Nerub, will once again bring you grim tidings from the frozen north. While we held a momentary advantage, this army of the dead is at the very gates of Azjol-Nerub. They gain more territory by the hour. Azj-Kahet may be distant with a dynasty of its own, but your kingdom is still Nerubian, and we require your aid. This enemy's ever-replenished numbers and unending ferocity are taking a great toll on all Spider Lords. Your location does not absolve you from coming to our aid when our existence is at its twilight hour. Reconsider my request, and do as the Empire demands. And this is Neferis' response. I, Neferis, Queen of Azj-Kahet, must unspool my deepest thoughts. 3 times now, King Anub'arak has demanded our empire intervene in matters to the north. The last diplomat he sent was webbed and dragged to the darkest reaches of my kingdom. Azj-Kahet is strong. Its people stronger still. We could perhaps turn the tide of battle were I to give the order to intervene. Yet, I cannot. I will not lose a single soul to that frozen tundra, far from our webs. This army of the dead has passed over Azj-Kahet. We are far too remote, beneath their notice. Sending my people to war would bring a fate worse than death to us. I will not answer his demands. I know Anub'arak asked for this war. He can finish it alone. That envoy she was talking about, you can actually still find out here in Azj-Kahet. So he's our next stop. We finally meet. I've been watching you for some time now. You will have to forgive my manners. Once I was an emissary to a great king. It is all in the past. Now I am simply Kahet. King? Yes, Anub'arak, ruler of Azjol-Nerub. He sent me here to ask for aid in a great war we were fighting against an army of the dead. He was a proud, strong, and mighty king. But I have heard whispers that he too fell. That his last days were spent serving the Lich King. All he is now is a horrifying memory. What happened to you? When I came before Queen Neferis with Anub'arak's demands, she cast me out and locked me away. Looking back, I think she knew what she was doing. If she'd allowed me to return to Azjol-Nerub, I would surely have been slain for my failure to bring the forces of Azj-Kahet with me. As far as I know, I am the last living Nerubian of Azjol-Nerub. For that, I suppose I owe her my life. Technically, there are very small pockets of Nerubians that are still alive. I mean, you meet some of them in Wrath of the Lich King. And there's also, in the island expeditions from BFA, a separate group of Nerubians that you learn left during the War of the Spider and tunneled out of Northrend to come across this island, which I think is called the Skittering Hollow, and have just been camped out there. And I think there's an NPC that you defeat during the island expedition or something, and he makes reference to having like a whole brood of eggs. So there's technically still Nerubians, or at least Nerubian eggs, that have survived from the War of the Spider. And there's more to say there, but I'm going to hold off on that until we do the dungeon quests. And this is the last bit of major dialogue in Anh'kahet that covers the War of the Spider.
Your chitin is so thin.
I heard your kind bury your bodies, burn them, even eat them if some are to be believed. Savages. We remember the War of the Spider. We know to remember our dead by carving their deeds in stone and silk, and then be rid of the bodies lest they become a weapon against us. Never again. The War of the Spider? Long ago, our people made war upon death itself, clad in frozen armor and armed with the power of a fallen god. Those who fought, fell. Those who fell, rose. Those who rose turned their mandibles upon us. Our former queen, the glorious Queen Neferis, sealed the tunnels between the Lost Kingdom and ours. That day we became the last kingdom. Here we will suffer no undeath, no dead gods, no traitor kings. Would you like to buy a symbol of your passing for when the time comes? So we sort of know what happens after that. The king of Azjol-Nerub, Anub'arak, gets killed by the Lich King and then subsequently raised as an undead and turned against his own people, made to conquer his own kingdom, which is how he got the title Traitor King, despite not really having any choice in the matter. I had briefly wondered if Azjol-Nerub was ruled exclusively by kings and Azj-Kahet was ruled exclusively by queens, but that's not actually the case. Azjol-Nerub did have a queen named Azret, and when Anub'arak was raised into an undead, he killed her. Now, I want to take you through the Azjol-Nerub and Anh'kahet dungeon quests from Wrath of the Lich King, because there's some really cool detail and specific flavor in them about the War of the Spider, but also some hints, maybe, at what the future of that kingdom may be. So, the War of the Spider went on for many years, but As we sort of know, the Lich King basically won. He was able to take most of the Nerubians, turn them into undead, and fight his war for him. But there are pockets of surviving Nerubians that, even in Wrath of the Lich King, still try to reclaim their lost kingdom. So these quests in Wrath sort of detail a little bit of lore about the War of the Spider, but also what they're going to be doing going forward. I envy you in a way, little Draenei. You are so fortunate as to bear witness to the first steps of the rebirth of the mighty empire of Azjol-Nerub. Anub'arak, the traitor king, makes his home in the once proud kingdom of Azjol-Nerub. He's twisted and perverted our homeland into the wretched squalor it is today. He rules over an army of undead Nerubians who have pledged themselves to serving the Lich King.
I sense the living. Be ready.
Bring an end to his reign. Throughout Azjol-Nerub, the scourged Nerubians carefully nurture eggs that will soon hatch, providing them Nerubian young to slaughter and raise. The eggs have been tainted with foul magics. Their only recourse is to dispose of them. Crick-Thyr, guardian of the gates to Azjol-Nerub, was not a traitor. He fell in the War of the Spider, defending our home from the scourge. As per his station, he was in possession of the key to the Hidden Empire. I'd like you to retrieve it, so it may be returned to its people. Is it done, Paladin? Has the traitor king finally met his end? A fierce glow emanates from all of Azok's eyes as he stares at the husk. It is done! Your name shall be recorded in the extensive history of our people, Draenei. Do not worry, Draenei. The eggs they found were but a fraction of our hidden stores within Azjol-Nerub. Our mighty kingdom shall be reborn. I was talking with a friend who actually brought up this quest, and was basically wondering if once we get the Last Titan, once we get that Northrend revamp, if we would potentially see this come to fruition. Like, if we would see the Empire of Azjol-Nerub reborn. Because I think I read somewhere that they had wanted to make it...
That tunnel. We must not let anyone through.
They'd wanted to make it a full zone, not just a dungeon. But I'm also not sure if... Like, does having a Nerubian zone in the War Within preclude that from happening? Or do you think that it would make it much more likely that we would actually see that happen? I'd like to see it happen, personally. It'd be cool to, like, get all of this new Azj-Kahet lore and then be able to go back to Azjol-Nerub again. Has Crick-Thyr's spirit been released from the curse of undeath? What of the talisman? Just as I suspected, most of the Empire has remained closed off since Crick-Thyr's final stand. Perhaps my people have already secured the depths and merely await release. Perhaps the faceless ones fester behind closed doors. Only time will tell. The exposed upper reaches of Azjol-Nerub must first be cleansed of Arthas's taint. So now we're going to do the Anh'kahet quests, and Anh'kahet, not to be confused with Azj-Kahet, is the old kingdom of Azjol-Nerub. It's the, like, basically the Arrakara of this Nerubian kingdom. It's the older city where they first originated from, much deeper. And I think in the RPG it says that the Scourge never quite tunneled this low. Obviously, to some extent they did, because there are, like, undead bosses in this dungeon, but that, beneath this is all of the old god stuff. Like, I think it says somewhere that they burrowed so deep that they ran into Yogg-Saron, and he was, I think actually this is in the dungeon journal. Yes, amid the Scourge's invasion of Azjol-Nerub, many of the kingdom's denizens tunneled underground to escape the Lich King's minions. Yet some of them dug too deep, exposing the tendrils of Yogg-Saron. Roused by this disturbance, the entity has sent one of its most ancient warriors, Herald Volage, to cull the beleaguered Nerubians and annihilate anyone foolish enough to threaten the old god. Our enemies believe us vanquished from the frozen wastes. We will show them the consequence of their ignorance. I once called Elder Naddox my teacher. That changed forever when I was forced to watch him mercilessly slaughter my friends and family as a servant of the damned. Find him within the depths and make him pay for his crimes, Draenei. With Naddox gone, I hope to take his place as a leader of my people. The empire of Azjol-Nerub is destined for greatness, Draenei. Prince Taldrem and his army of Scourge use the same wards we once used to hide our empire to keep themselves safe from the native denizens of the icy depths. Deactivate the wards and slaughter the Scourge guarding them. My forces will help the natives slaughter the rest. Excellent. You heard a series of clicking sounds. Now to vanquish our other foe. And my people struggle against the forces of the undead. They dug deeper as they lost ground. They inadvertently exposed minions of the old gods, known only as the Faceless. In the end, we could not fight a war on two fronts. With your aid, perhaps the Faceless will finally fall. You have done well, Paladin. With the servants of the old gods defeated, the time is upon my people to retake our ancient home.
I cannot carry more.
So, throughout history, there's not really a lot of overlap between the kingdoms. Azjol-Nerub and Azj-Kahet remain, for the most part, pretty separate, other than their origins and the War of the Spider. But there's a few things that I think imply that there were interactions or like some degree of crossover between the two, and we saw a little bit of that learning about the War of the Spider with that one NPC saying that they cremated their dead. But there's also some profession items that make a reference to Northrend. There's a part of this city that has a lot of different profession vendors, and they each have specific items. There's an herbalism one that talks about how they used rare herbs from both Azj-Kahet and Northrend. There's a mining one that makes reference to how they used to mine Serenite, but now don't, which isn't like that surprising considering that they came from Northrend in the first place. But there's also an inscription and possibly also enchanting one that's a book called, I think, Lessons Learned from the Fall of Anh'kahet, and has a description, something to the effect of them researching the Lich King's runes in order to subvert them in the event that the Lich King should come for them. I think despite Neferes completely closing off Azj-Kahet, the Nerubians here did prepare for the eventuality that the Lich King would come for them as he did their kin in Northrend. There's also a very deep lore cut from Wrath of the Lich King from an archaeology item. There's an item called the Scepter of Nazar Azret, who was the queen of Azjol-Nerub during the War of the Spider, as I said. And part of the text on it says, "It is rumored that Nerubian queens can genetically pass knowledge from mother to daughter." And when I discovered this, I got so excited because this is something that they clearly took and just ran with when it came to the War Within. Because there's a small lore book here, Strands of Memory, that talks about how the Nerubian queens and sages can pass on their memories to future generations through these things called strands. Let me read it to you. "One lifetime is not enough to master the arts of magic, alchemy, and the many etiquettes and disciplines required to run the last kingdom. Thus we use strands to pass memory from one Nerubian to the next. With a strand comes the legacy of our people." Only our sages and queens may pass strands from one generation to the next. Their forms were refined to be able to weave and incorporate even the most impossibly small elements of memory. This is not a natural process, but a project that requires time, dedication, resources, and intention. In this way, only chosen strands are passed to the next generation. Knowledge of how to create strands for other forms of our people was lost with the fall of the Black Empire. There's other lore books too. One of them talks about how they didn't want to kill one of the former queens of Azj-Kahet because they didn't want to lose her strand. They wanted to preserve that memory. And I just thought this was such a cool detail that, like, this goes back to the tiniest piece of lore we got in Wrath of the Lich King. I think that's so neat. There's also something else I want to say here about the timeline, because I think it becomes clear that the Nerubians in Azjol-Nerub and Azj-Kahet had to be the same kingdom long enough for them to forget how to create strands for other forms, or to even forget other forms, which is covered in another of the lore books. There's lore books throughout Azj-Kahet on the different sort of Nerubian evolution forms. There's like sages, there's skitters, there's lords, and the one for skitters talks about how it was one of their newest forms. So at some point these kingdoms were the same, but they also had to be separate for long enough for us to see skitters in Azj-Kahet, but not in Azjol-Nerub. And that doesn't really give us any concrete idea of the timeline or anything, but it's sort of nice to have, like, touchstones maybe for at which point they diverged and the differences between them. So something else I want to talk about. The seat of power in Azj-Kahet is called Nerubar Palace. Well, as luck would have it, there's also a group of Nerubians in Northrend. They're just like quest fodder in a Borean Tundra quest, called the Nerubar Nerubians. But they're spelled differently, in that Nerubar Palace uses a dash and the Nerubar Nerubians use an apostrophe, and there's no, like, concrete connection between them or anything. I'm just assuming it's some word in their language that carries some significance. But to make a completely baseless theory based off of absolutely nothing, I sort of wondered if, like, the Nerubar Nerubians might actually be from Azj-Kahet and were either given leave by Neferus to help Anubarak, or they left of their own volition, just as a way to, like, connect the words. But there's literally nothing to give any credence to that theory, just, like, food for thought. Also, there's a Nerubian in the Nerubar Palace raid named Anh'kahet, and there's a town in Borean Tundra, an old Nerubian town, though that might be RPG lore. I think they also call it a Scourge town, named Anh'kahet. The other thing I want to point out, too, in terms of crossover between these kingdoms, is the architecture. And, like, obviously they're the same aesthetically, they come from the same place, but the cities are actually built very similarly. They both have an old city that they were built on top of and out of. We learned in the dungeon quests that the old city in Azjol-Nerub was Anh'kahet, and the old city in Azj-Kahet is Arakahet. Coincidentally, both of these cities were built on top of old god stuff. I think that makes more sense in the context of Northrend because they used to be with the old gods, but it's really interesting that it also happened here. Like, I can't imagine that that was intentional, but also at the same time, you probably dig deep enough anywhere in Azeroth and you're gonna run into old god stuff regardless. So... Also, completely random side note, but I think this is also a really cracked, funny bit of lore about the Nerubians. In the first round of the creative development Q&A they did, we learned that when the Akira got to Northrend, they saw the Tol'vir, who are actually Titan creations, and liked their architecture so much they decided to take it for themselves. But when the Lich King started conquering the Nerubians, he saw their architecture and decided he really liked it, and he wanted to take it for himself. So in a really roundabout way, the Lich King is just using Titan architecture. If the Tol'vir inspired the Nerubians and the Nerubians inspired the Lich King, it's just funny. And that's pretty much it. A lot of the other lore that we learn in Azj-Kahet about the Nerubians, like their forms of evolution and the pheromones, is all pretty new and exclusive to the War Within. I think, like, the other Nerubians had forms because we see a lot of the same models and stuff, but I think the information about their forms of evolution and stuff is new to Azj-Kahet. Correct me if I'm wrong. But that's pretty much all of the crossover that occurs between the two kingdoms and all of the lore that we knew about the Nerubians before this expansion. Most of it had to do with either their origins or the War of the Spider. All of, like, the cultural world building has happened in this new expansion. So that's how the Nerubians we knew before connect in lore to the Nerubians that we know now. And that pretty much is an abridged version of their history. There's obviously a lot more details to get into, but those are the broad strokes. So thank you for joining me for this little lore video on the Nerubians. I hope it was sensical and informative, and I hope to see you for the next one. Whoever decided to have an Anh'kahet and then an Azj-Kahet played an entirely cruel joke. Bro, my inventory is not gonna make it through these dungeons. Let me out. Oh, this is gonna be real rough. It doesn't make sense. What was the word I had in my mind? Did he get a new model? Oh. No, I'm good. Never mind. I should not do this in this spec. Don't mind me. Just getting sidetracked. Yo, a pet! If I can remember where they are, because I did not look that up before this. No, it's the wrong way! Let me rephrase that. Hold on. What was my point? Oh.